Isn't that awesome? All right. How we doing this morning? Everybody awake? You ready? Okay. Man, I'll tell you what. Let me just say this. I wish we could do that every Sunday. Don't you? That was just the best way to start the service. And I just want to say welcome. If you're here for the first time, you picked a great Sunday to be here at First Christian Church. My name's Jimmy. I'm one of the pastors here at FCC. And you're here on Disability Ministry Sunday. In case you're just waking up, this is a Sunday where we highlight one of the most important ministries as part of our church here at FCC. And so you're going to get to hear more of what you've just experienced, hear it a little bit from some people who are part of that ministry. But let me just answer a question right off the bat, okay? Because I've actually had people ask me this question, and if you're asking this question this morning, I just want to explain. Why would we take an entire Sunday and highlight one ministry when we have so many great things we do here at FCC, so many things that have impact in the community? Why take a whole Sunday just to talk about this? And this would be my answer, okay? I would start by saying this. I would start by saying, did you know that there are 1 billion people in the world who are touched by disability? That's billion with a B. 1 billion people, and specifically in our county, in Stark County, the average of families who are touched by disability is a little bit higher than the national average. So in Stark County, 1 in 4 families are touched by disability in some way. That means if it's not your family, then several people you know are a part of a family that's touched by disability. How about this? How about the fact, I could keep going. How about the fact that people affected by disabilities make up the largest minority group in the world? Did you know that? Or the fact that people with disabilities are the largest unreached people group in the world. In other words, if we're looking at people who haven't been reached with the good news of Jesus, people with disabilities are the number 1 people group in the world that's not yet been reached with that good news. And so there are reasons that exists, but I would say this is one of the biggest reasons we do this on a Sunday here at FCC every year, is that another statistic that is really sad, kind of breaks my heart, is that people with disabilities attend church at a far lower rate than typical people. And there are reasons why. There are barriers that make it harder: transportation, accessibility, everything from accessibility of buildings and facilities and places to accessibility of programs and resources. There are just all kinds of barriers there. But then, there are other kinds of barriers too, like discrimination. I just talked to a guy in between the services who told me that his family had been asked to leave their church because they have a child with disabilities. And that breaks my heart. So there are barriers like discrimination. There are barriers like, we could keep going down that road of reasons why it's hard. Like when you do show up, you don't feel welcomed, or you don't feel valued, or you don't feel wanted. And so here's the deal. Just to clarify for anybody who wants to know, if you've ever wondered why we take a Sunday once a year and we celebrate our disability ministry, it's because we want every single person who has a disability and every one of their family members and every one of their friends and every one of you to know that people with disabilities are loved by Jesus and valued by Jesus, and they are loved by First Christian Church and welcome here. So that's why we do what we do. Now let me catch you up on the last few weeks to explain why this is a perfect fit for the series that we're in. We've been in a teaching series called 4 through the month of October. And we're talking about what we as a church are going to be for. And we said this every week, but if I could boil it down to a thought, I would say this. I would say there are too many churches, and even stepping back from just church, there are just too many people in the world who are known for what they're against, or they're known for who they don't like, or they're known for what they want to protest or cancel or boycott. And we're saying, we're putting our flag in the ground and saying we're going to be different. We're going to be a church, and we're going to be people who are not known for what we're against. We want to be people who are known for what we are for. We want to be known for who we are for, not who we're against. And so we've taken this whole month and we started to talk about that. 3 weeks ago, we talked about how we're going to be a church that's for the one. We're going to be a church that's for people who are far from Jesus. And we talked about a story that Jesus told about a shepherd who had 100 sheep and one wandered off, and he went and chased that one. And in the story, the shepherd represents Jesus. And the story was meant to communicate that Jesus loves people who are far from him so much that he has and will do absolutely anything to go and reach them and bring them close to him. And so as his church, as his hands, as his feet, as his people, we should do the same thing. And so we're going to be for the one. We're going to be for people who are far from Jesus. And church, we are going to do anything and everything we can think of short of sin to go and reach people who are far from him and lead them to him with grace and with truth and help them find hope and experience community and live with purpose. That's what we're going to be about as a church. So that was week 1. Week 2, we talked about how we're going to be for our city. That we're not just a church that's in Canton. We're a church that's for Canton. And we want our community to be a better place just because we're here being the church, just because we're doing what Jesus simply asked us to do. We want the difference to be noticeable. We want it to be something that people see and they're thankful for, and that when they see it and when they understand that it happened because we're just being the church, we're being who Jesus asked us to be, they're gonna say, okay, I wanna be a part of that. I can get on board with that, right? That's why we wanna be for our city. And so let me specifically say, if you missed week 2 of this series where we talked about that, please go back and watch it, because I'm telling you right now, if you have ever in your life had this thought, if you've ever thought, man, I wish more churches would walk the walk and not just talk the talk, then in week 2, you get to hear all the ways we're about to walk the walk, church. It's about to get really exciting around here, okay? So that was week 2. Week 3, last week, we talked about how we're gonna be a church that's for the kingdom, not our castle. We're going to be a church that invests in the kingdom of God and that focuses on building the kingdom of God. And we shared this thought that what happens outside the walls of this place is far more important than what happens inside the walls of this place. But that as the hands and feet of Jesus, we should be going out on mission every single week, carrying that good news to the people that we work with and we go to school with and we interact with and we see them at Walmart and the mall and everywhere else we go. We carry the good news with them. We go out on mission knowing that's our job to do. And as we do that and as we share that good news with people, they see a difference in us that communicates something that they might just want to experience themselves. And all of a sudden doors start to open up for conversations about Jesus to take place. And then we start to see transformation. And it's because we're not just trying to grow our church, we're trying to build the kingdom. So that's going to be our focus. It's not about growing a church, it's about building the kingdom. Which brings me to this week. We're going to talk about something that's been very important here for the past several years and decades and going back way, way, way in history, but continues to be important and will be important in the future. And that is that we are going to be a church where Jesus is for all people. Now, one of the things I love most about Jesus is he was a great storyteller. He told stories. If you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these accounts that these 4 men wrote down of kind of the story of Jesus' life and ministry and the things he did and how he lived and how he walked, you see really quickly that Jesus was an incredible storyteller. And specifically, he would tell stories that we call parables to help us understand things about the kingdom of God that maybe in our own limited human understanding, we'd have a hard time wrapping our minds around. But he'd tell them in story form, and he'd use things that were relatable from everyday life just so we would understand a little bit about who God is and about his character. Or a little bit about what the kingdom of God is or the kingdom of heaven is and how we can be a part of it and how we are a part of it because, as we said last week, the kingdom is not coming, the kingdom has come. And so Jesus would tell these parables because he wanted us to begin to understand. And today we're going to look at a parable. If you have a Bible with you, open up to Luke chapter 10. We're going to look at a story that Jesus told that has a whole lot of meaning in it that's still relevant even now 2,000 years later, just as relevant today as it was on the day he first told the story. If you don't have a Bible, we'll put it on the screen, but read along with me in Luke chapter 10. And this parable of the Good Samaritan starts in verse 25. This is what it says. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Well, this is nothing new. This happened all the time. So Jesus is thinking, here we go again. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, I don't know if this was a genuine question or a loaded question. Jesus probably did. But Jesus chooses to answer with a question. Maybe he's trying to feel this guy out. Maybe he's trying to figure out, do you have an agenda here or do you really want to know? But Jesus responds to the question with a question. This is something that in the Jewish religious educational system, they would teach teachers to do. When someone asks you a question, you ask them a question. So Jesus says, what is written in the law? How do you read it? He puts the man on the spot. Well, check out the man's answer. It says he answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at another example of a time when a religious leader came to test Jesus. And again, they're, as always, trying to trip him up and catch him, saying something controversial or something he really couldn't say that they could kind of nail him on, And so a couple weeks ago, we looked at this passage where a religious leader came to Jesus and said, Jesus, there's 613 laws and rules and regulations in the old law. Like, what's the most important one? And Jesus answered not with one, but with two rules to follow, I guess you might call them, or we call them commandments. He said, number one, you just love God with everything you have, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then he said the second is like it, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, I think it's interesting that in this account today, this religious leader comes to test Jesus. And when Jesus asks the question and puts this back on him, what's the answer the man gives? It's the same answer Jesus gave this other religious leader when he asked the same question. Kind of makes you wonder if this guy was in the room on the day that Jesus was teaching before, right? Well, these verses weren't anything new. Jesus was quoting from the Old Testament scroll of Deuteronomy when he said to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And so is this religious leader. And so maybe there's no symbolism in here, maybe there's no significance, but I just think it's interesting and maybe not a coincidence that he answers with the same response that Jesus gave to the other religious leader. And Jesus thought that was appropriate too, because he continues on. Verse 28, he says, you've answered correctly. Jesus replied, do this and you will live. But the man wanted to justify himself, and so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? Now, a couple things from here. He wanted to justify himself. Why do you think he wanted to justify himself? Could it be possible that as Jesus said, you've answered correctly, do this and you will live, somewhere deep down inside the man felt some guilt because he knew he wasn't doing it? I also think it's interesting that out of these two commands, right, love God with everything you have, love your neighbor as you love yourself, this religious leader didn't take any issue with the part about loving God, right? Where did he have an issue? With loving his neighbor. When it came to loving other people, all of a sudden this guy had a problem. And so trying to justify himself, trying to find a way to not maybe feel guilty, trying to find a way around this instruction from Jesus, he said, well, who's my neighbor? And in reply, Jesus told a story. It went like this. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now you need to know that's about 18 miles through rocky, barren desert terrain, mountains and hills and valleys, and it's a long walk, okay? We're not talking like to the next town over. We're talking a ways, 18 miles. And that terrain was the perfect setting for an ambush. And that's what happens in the story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, now just time out right here, okay? Here's why this is a big deal. We've talked about this a little bit throughout the year, so if you've been tracking with us, maybe you've heard a little bit of this. But let me explain why it's a big deal that Jesus would include the detail that a Samaritan man is the one who's next up in the story. You see, the man who's traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho was probably a Jewish man. First of all, he's coming from Jerusalem. That would be our first clue that he's probably Jewish. Second of all, Jesus was Jewish. He's telling the story, so that would make sense. Like, there's our second clue. And third, he's telling the story to a religious leader in what would have been largely a Jewish audience. And so, all signs point to the fact that this man who gets jumped in the wilderness would have been a Jewish person. But the Samaritan man, now here's the significance of this. The Jewish people and the Samaritans, boy, they didn't like each other. They had some disagreements over how to worship God and where to worship God that went back for centuries and centuries and centuries. And these disagreements had really gone far beyond not seeing eye to eye. Now it was violent. It wasn't a thing where it was like if you were a Jewish person and a Samaritan was coming down the other side of the road, you would just walk by. Oftentimes, like fights would break out. It was a violent, hate-fueled situation between these two groups of people, the Jewish people and the Samaritan people. And so in the story, you need to know that because this Jewish man, he's traveling down the road, right? And he gets jumped and he gets beat up and left on the side of the road, left for dead, as Jesus says. And who walks by? Well, first of all, a priest walks by a Jewish religious leader who you would think would see this man laying on the side of the road and take pity on him and stop and help him out, right? But what does the priest do? Well, he doesn't want to get his hands dirty, and so he crosses over to the other side of the road and just continues on and kind of looks the other way, right? If nobody knows I saw him, then they can't accuse me of anything. He doesn't want to be unclean or whatever the case is. So then who's the next person that walks by? It's a Levite, another Jewish religious leader who happens to see this man, and he's laying on the side of the road, and what does he do? He crosses over to the other side of the road and he continues on just like the priest. But then a Samaritan man, least likely hero in the story, comes along, and here's what happens next. Jesus says, "But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. And he went to him and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey and brought him to the inn, and he took care of him." And remember, they're out somewhere in the desert between these two cities, 18 miles apart. And so it's not like he just picked him up and carried him across the street to the inn, right? Here's what he did. He put him on his own donkey, and the Samaritan man walked, however far that would have been, and took this man to where he could get some care and some rest. It says the next day he took out 2 denarii. Each denarii would have been worth about a day's wages. So 2 days of his income he takes and he pays the innkeeper. And he says, "Look after this man, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. I'm going to come back and check on him," is what this guy's saying. Now Jesus says, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? So let me ask you, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." And Jesus said, "Duh. Go and do likewise." Go and do likewise. Here's what Jesus is saying, okay? Essentially, the point of the story would be this. Jesus is saying, love your neighbor. But then there's a deeper level, okay? It's not just about a technicality of a law or a commandment. Jesus goes to a deeper place. He says, really, the heart of this is he's saying, everyone matters. Everyone matters. Now, can I tell you why this is such a big deal for you and me today? Is that we live in a world where every time you turn on the TV, or every time you log into Facebook, or every time you listen to anybody talk, man, there is just this like underlying tone, and sometimes it's not so underlying or subversive. Sometimes it's right in your face, right? There's this constant just barrage of this message that, you know, that either you don't matter or somebody else doesn't matter. But let me tell you, that is a pandemic in our world far worse than COVID. We live in a world where we love to tell each other, sometimes in unintentional ways, you don't matter, or you don't matter as much as I do, or you don't matter as much as somebody else does, or we're constantly told, I don't matter. And so what Jesus is trying to communicate in this story is really, really important. It's a super important, really hope-filled message for you and for me that everyone matters. Everybody. See, Jesus in the story, he's communicating that it doesn't matter about your background. And we would say the same thing. We would say it doesn't matter about your background. It doesn't matter about your family makeup. It doesn't matter about your race or ethnicity. It doesn't matter about your religious affiliation or your political views or any of that kind of stuff. Or specifically, as we highlight today, it doesn't matter about your level of ability or disability. Everyone matters. And I think it's so fitting in the story. That again, the man who was least likely to be the hero, least likely to stop, least likely to show pity or mercy on this wounded, dying man was the Samaritan, who by all cultural standards should have been the enemy, should have been the one who would have walked across the street and continued on his way, right? Well, there's a theologian named N.T. Wright. Some of you might be familiar with him, and maybe you've even read some of the stuff that he's written. But he has a podcast I listen to where people will write in and ask him questions, and I like to listen to it because, number one, he's really smart. Number two, I love his accent. So I listen to this podcast because you ever notice how just English people sound smart? So I listen to the podcast because I think he sounds smart. So on the episode that dropped this week, he's talking about the early church, specifically the Acts 2 church. And he shares in this podcast that for the Acts 2 church, they didn't grow every day, as it says in Acts chapter 2, because they went out and preached at people all the time. In fact, if you read Acts chapter 2, going out and preaching to the crowds was not something they actually did all that often. They would teach each other stuff, but they would do it as they gathered in people's homes and broke bread. And then they would do it as they, here's my favorite part about the Acts 2 church. If they found out that somebody else in the church had a need, you know what they would do is they would gather up some of their stuff and they'd run to the flea market and start pawning it off to get some money to go and help their brother or their sister who had some need. Now, could you just imagine if you lived in a culture, and I'll bet you can, because we do. If you lived in a culture where it's me, myself, and I, and people who put others first are few and far between, if you came across a whole group of people who loved each other so much that they were willing to do anything and everything it took to care for each other and love each other and show mercy and compassion on each other and give food to each other and put roofs over each other's heads, I mean, wouldn't you look at that and immediately just step back and think, man, something's different. I wonder what that is. And in the back of your mind, the whole time you're thinking, I'd like to be a part of whatever that is. And that's why the early church grew. And it's because it was full of people who just loved each other so much. And just like Jesus is trying to communicate in the story of the Good Samaritan, it was people who valued other people not because of any qualifier or didn't devalue people because of a disqualifier. They just loved people because they understood that every person is made uniquely in the image of God. And so they have worth and they have value. That's what Jesus is trying to tell us in this story, that everyone matters. In church, that's why it is our mission. We exist at First Christian Church to reach out with unconditional love to all people and lead them to be all-in disciples of Jesus. That is our mission. That's what we do. We reach out to all people, everybody. And as best we can, and we're not perfect and we're going to mess it up, but the best that we can, we do it with unconditional love, just the way Jesus did. Not qualified on anything or disqualified because of anything. We just love people the way that Jesus loves people because he told us to. And then as we do, we're trying to lead people to Jesus and point them to be all-in disciples. In other words, to be people who find and follow Jesus and are committed to the mission of Jesus, and they're being changed by Jesus as people who reflect that transformation in their life. That's what we mean when we say we want to lead people to be all-in disciples of Jesus. And so our vision as a church, again, is to help people find hope and experience community and live with purpose. That's what the early church did, and that's what Jesus has called us to do. And it's not some people, it's all people. It's all people. We want that for everyone. And so the question you may be asking here on DD Sunday, let me just kind of zero in a little further. As we read this story that Jesus told, as we talk about that, you might be asking, well, what does this have to do specifically with disability ministry? Like, why this message today? Why this story today? Why now? Well, yeah, Jesus is trying to communicate the point that everyone matters, but there's a deeper point that he's trying to communicate in this story, and that is, it's not okay to overlook anyone. We are called to be voices for the voiceless. And we are called to advocate for people who can't advocate for themselves. That is the place. That's what the church should be doing. And so we're going to do that. We're going to do that. This is so important because if we're going to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this world, and if people are going to find and follow him because of us, it's because they're going to see it, not in a message that we preach, but reflected in our lives. And in the way that we carry ourselves, the way that we treat each other. See, Jesus loved the people that other people love to ignore. And he spent time with people that other people love to not spend any time with, to cast off. And he saw value and worth in people that other people did not. And because of that, people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. And man, if they're going to like us too, and if we're going to have opportunities to lead them to him, then we have to do the same thing. So it's not okay to overlook anybody. Certainly not people with disabilities. Even people who are nothing like us. It's not okay to overlook anybody, no matter what they or who they are or where they're from or any of that kind of stuff. I want to be clear about that. However, we live in a world where, like in America, prenatally, if a child is diagnosed with Down syndrome, they're aborted 68% of the time. And if you look at a country like Denmark, that number's closer to 100% of the time. And even the church, honestly, the church doesn't have a great track record with this. We've already talked about some of the barriers. Limited transportation is an issue. Can I just stop right here, by the way? And I just want to thank a few people. We have a small group of people who come out here early every single Sunday morning and far beyond the time that some of us are even out of bed, and they pick up vans and buses in our parking lot, and they go out across our city, and they give people rides to church. Some of them are people with disabilities. It's some of our older folks who are part of the church. It's just other people who don't have a ride, and they don't do it. They don't ask for any glory. They don't do it for any recognition. They just come and they serve every single week so people can come and be a part of the community of the church. And I'm so thankful for them. Can we just give them a hand real quick? I know some are in the room. We got one of our guys, I'm sure there's more, but one of our guys sitting right here who's been driving one of those vehicles for years and years, and I'm just so thankful for that. Thank you very much. So we know transportation's an issue. That's one. There's limited accessibility to church buildings, and I'm not knocking anybody, just a lot of buildings aren't ADA accessible, so it's tough for people with mobility issues to be a part of those churches. A lot of churches lack programs or assistance for people with disabilities, things that make the programming accessible or make the experience accessible. And I alluded to this earlier, but I could name you names of many families who are part of our church, and they're here because they were asked to leave their church because their child or their family member with a disability was a nuisance or an annoyance. Let me tell you a story about my uncle. My Uncle Steve, my mom's brother, when he was a baby, he was born typical, but when he was a baby, this was in the days before car seats were much of like a thing. My grandma was going somewhere one day. My great-grandma was driving. My grandma was sitting in the passenger seat holding my uncle. And for whatever reason, my great-grandma was distracted and drifted off the road and hit a telephone pole. And my little baby uncle came out of my grandma's hands and hit the dashboard of the car and experienced severe head trauma. And because of that, he's dealt with pretty major disabilities his entire life. Some of them are intellectual, very severe, even some mild developmental disabilities. It's just, that's been his life. So growing up, my grandparents and my mom's family, they were part of a church that had a lot of good people in it, but they just didn't know how to handle somebody with the kind of disabilities that my uncle dealt with his entire life. And so there were a few people in the church who really loved him, but there were more people in the church who mostly tolerated him, and then some who really didn't at all. And I remember hearing my grandma say one time that there were many times when they considered if they would have to leave and find a new church because they just didn't feel welcomed or at home. And because they dealt with that a lot. And so I just want to say that if that's you, if you're here because somewhere else you didn't feel welcomed, if that's you and you're here because your family has been trying to find a place to belong where you knew you'd be more than tolerated, but you would be appreciated and loved. If you're here because you discovered that that's a part of who we are, I just want to say, number one, we love you and you're welcome here. And number two, nobody will ever ask you to leave this church. You have a place here. Yep. 10 years ago, the very first time I walked through the front doors of this church, I walked into the middle of day services just doing what they do on like an average Tuesday morning, right? And I asked about it, and when I was told about our disability ministry and our day services program, I was interviewing for a job. That's the reason I was here. When I was told about that, as far as I was concerned, the interview was over. I knew this is where I wanted to be. Because if my uncle had a place like this, my whole family's lives would have been different. And many of you in the room today, you can attest to that. It's because you found that community here that your lives are better than what they were. And it's just because you've experienced the grace of God through people who love you. And so to come all the way back around and take this full circle, guys, the reason we do this once a year is because it's our heartbeat. It's our heartbeat. We're going to be a church that is for all people. I'll give you a few examples of how we're going to do that. We've been, for a while now, creating and developing resources that are accessible, that make it easier for people to connect, and we're going to continue to do that, whether it's overcoming language barriers or sight barriers or other disability barriers. We know we got a long way to go, but we're going to continue to pour resources and effort into making this a place where people with all kinds of challenges can find a place to belong. That's going to be a big part of what we do. We're going to continue to be a church that we're going to pour into our Latino ministry, reaching out to that community within our city. We're going to continue to teach English as a second language. We're going to continue to offer other resources. We do live Spanish translation almost every Sunday morning. You can come in here and you can listen to the service, and as it's happening, we have somebody backstage translating live into Spanish. Most of you didn't even know that we do that because, again, it's some people who serve just out of the goodness of their hearts, and it's not for glory or recognition, but we're going to continue to do that. We're going to love on the Latino community. We're going to continue to offer Be the Bridge as a way to work toward racial reconciliation in our city, and as the church, we want to be right in the middle of that effort. We want to be right in the middle of restoring those relationships. And by the way, that program, that's not something that happens here. That's something that happens out in our city, and we're a part of it, working with some other great churches, but we're going to continue to be a part of it because that's something that matters deeply to us. We're going to continue to invest in our disability ministry and our day services program. We're going to continue to pour time and energy and resources into those things and provide spaces for those things because they matter so much to us. They are more than just a ministry or a program, a thing we do. It's who we are. It is our heart. It's in our DNA. And so let me just say really quickly, if you're hearing me talk about all this today and you are thinking, this sounds so cool, I would love to be a part of it, we need you. We need you. We have Kingdom Builders, which is a Bible study on Sunday mornings for adults with disabilities. We have another class called Shine, which is the same thing but for kids with disabilities. And we need volunteers because we have people coming through our doors every weekend who are anxious to learn about Jesus, and they need some people to teach them. And so maybe that's you. But let me go even a step further than that and just say we have a day services program that's Monday through Friday. Adults with all kinds of different disabilities come here, and it's everything from day hab services to job skills training, and it's the most incredible thing that I've witnessed since I've been here. And here's what I love about it. It's a place where a lot of people who would be alone 5 days a week have found community and purpose. And we have a wait list for that program. We have individuals who really want to come and be a part of that program, and literally we don't have a place for them because we need staff. And like you've been hearing for a while now, like most places, hiring is not an easy thing to do. But we need staff. We desperately need staff because we want to have a place for these individuals to find community. You talk to some of the ones who are a part of it already, and they'll tell you it's life-changing. You talk to their families, and they'll tell you even more so it's life-changing. And we want to give that space to as many people as we can. And so if you're somebody that thinks, man, I might be able to be a part of that, or I might want to be a part of that, or that makes your heart beat a little bit faster, can I ask you, come and talk to me today? Because we would love to talk to you. Our desire is to create that kind of community space for as many people as we possibly can. And it's only possible because we have so many people who love our individuals in the program so much. Now, it's probably a good time for me to say, whether we're talking disability ministry or anything else, being a church where Jesus is for all people is not an easy thing. It's messy. It's really hard. Sometimes there are difficult conversations we have to have, but it's worth it. It's worth it because when you get to hear the stories that many of you are going to get to hear a whole lot more of, because one of the things we're going to work really hard to do is tell more stories. When you get to hear the stories of how Jesus is changing lives, you understand why it's so important that this continues to be a place where everybody's welcome. We're going to be that kind of place. Last week I said, I shared a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he said, only love gets close enough to know. In other words, only if you love somebody are you willing to get your hands and your feet dirty. Most of us want to stay away from the messes, right? But Jesus loved us enough to get his hands and his feet dirty. And we're going to do our best to do that. Now, I can stand up here and I can tell you all day long how fulfilling it is and how rewarding it is to be a part of those kind of ministries, specifically our disability ministry. I can stand up here and I can tell you stories and I can preach it to you, but it would be far better for you to hear it from some of the people who are some of the most amazing people I know that are part of our disability ministry team. I would love for you to hear from them in their words why it's such an incredible thing to be a part of. So check this video out.